Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the festival. Welcome everyone who's here, hidden under those tents very wisely, because I think it's gonna rain soon. At least that's what the weather forecast told us, and that's what we've seen so far. Welcome everyone who's following us live on the web stream. We're gonna talk about the expectations and the political reality of the youth of the future in Europe, what the youth want and what they might get. So we have an excellent panel here, very young but very experienced, it seems. Officially, one person is not young anymore, the rest of us still are. You can all guess who's approaching the midlife crisis, but we have a great panel starting from my right. Kristen Aigro from Estonian Roundtable for Development Cooperation and former board member of the Youth European Council. Hi.
European
Youth Forum. Okay, yeah.
But everybody.
First mistake this, already in the introduction from a journalist. So then we have Gustav Götzberg, member of the Swedish Moderate Party. Hello.
Hello.
You're waiting for Brexit, I understand, to go to the European Parliament.
Yes, I am, but that was a secret. But thank you for pointing it out.
Right, okay. Then we have Lukas Ilves, who has a lot of titles, but let's just say that he's currently head of strategy at Gartime. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Wonderful. And then we have the very experienced Glen Järats, who is the Director for European Union Affairs at the Estonian Government Office. For how long will you still hold on to that post, Glenn?
We'll see.
Very diplomatic answer. So we also have questions for you, the good audience, and I would like to actually know you better. I know some of you, but not all of you. So for a little warm-up exercise, I suggest you take out your smartphones, those of you who haven't done so yet. Find your way to worksup.com. You have all actually the coordinates in a very old school manner nailed to that tree over there. So when you go to worksup.com, you have to enter the event ID, which is Future 2035. So Future and then numbers 2035. Then you should head to a place which has a title Tasks, and there you have 3 questions. And these 3 questions are there for me to know you better. So the 3 questions should be as followed. Do you follow politics and events related to the EU? You can choose yes, no, or I don't know. Do you believe that you are able to influence EU decision-making process? And do you feel that the EU needs a change? Could you kindly find a minute to answer those 3 questions? And then we're going to see what you guys thought after I ask the first questions from this great, young, experienced panel. So to start off our discussion, I must say I was a bit tempted to talk about everything because, well, what do we want from the future and what do we actually get? It's a pretty wide topic, but I narrowed it down a bit. So let's first talk about the youth in politics in general. And I mean, when you look at the statistics, the youth, the millennials as they call it, those people aged from 18 to 35, they make up roughly a quarter of EU's population, right? A bit less than 100 million. What, 90 million youth in that age bracket? But at the same time, they have a record of not showing up to the polls. Now, in 2014, there was just like 27% of youth that age who voted in the EU election. And Kristen, you've actually campaigned for lowering the voting age. But I mean, when we look at that turnout, what good is lowering the voting age if the youth don't really show up?
Yeah, I mean, lowering the voting age to me is a more broad question than just having young people show up. Voting is a right. And so we need to ask the question of how old are you, at what age are you ready to vote? And that's where we should draw the line. This is actually the process we went through in Estonia, because I formerly work with the Estonian National Youth Council, and they are the first NGO in Estonia to change the constitution, so to lower the voting age. This was a very thorough work. We worked with researchers in Tallinn University, and the research really shows that at that age, young people are ready to vote. They understand society and societal processes well enough to do it.
But they don't. Many of them don't.
Yes. And so if we progress to that, then it becomes more complex, because the share of young people in society is smaller and smaller. We are an aging society in Europe. Therefore, politicians have less and less incentive to actually speak to young people or make promises to young people. And their focus is towards older generations, meaning that politics really ends up leaving young people behind.
So do you think the problem for voter apathy is caused by politicians who are, well, middle-aged guys mostly, or older guys, talking to similar-minded people and not really looking at what young people want or what do they want to hear?
I think that's a lot of the problem, that our politicians are too similar. We need more diversity amongst politicians. We need more young people who are actually elected and who get electable positions within political parties, because that's a whole other conversation and challenge. But indeed, the sad fact is that, of course, because older people are a more active voter group, it makes sense to target them, and there's very little incentive to actually talk to young people and to talk about the issues that young people care about. So our political system is broken in that way, I would say.
Right. Well, we have a fix, or we have an example of a guy trying to fix that from Sweden. Hi, Gustav.
Hello.
So why did you decide to go into politics? I mean, the last debate, I think, concluded with the sad note that politics isn't really attractive for young people or for the bright guys in general. Why did you make that call? And I mean, you joined a conservative party. That's something.
At the age of 12. Which I don't really recommend to anybody, even though I think that you have passed that limit of being 12 years old. No, I don't think that me myself serves as a good example of talking about young people in politics per se, because I joined a political party of mine in Sweden back when I was 12 years old in 2015. So now you can add on how old I am. I think that for me it was because I was very interested in politics and in news. I always watched the news on the television with my mother and father back home. My first memory is not of me riding in a bicycle. It's a memory from the war in Bosnia in 1998. So for me it has always been there. What I see now is not I wouldn't say apathy when it comes to young people in politics. I think that as a matter of fact, we see more incentives and more ways of young people getting involved in politics, not in the old-fashioned way, but in other ways. You don't have to join a political party these days to make a change in society. And my fellow Swede, Greta Thunberg, might be a good example of that as well, that you can really do something and you can really make sure that you can change society to the better, even if you don't wear a suit and run for parliament.
But I mean, do you agree with this notion that in general, politicians these days in Europe, they really don't care what the youth think?
No, because I don't think that you can say that there's a way youth think. I think very, very different from a 25-year-old communist. Because we are young, of course, and of course we have some mutual perspectives, but we are also individuals and we have different ideas and we have different experiences, and we live in Paide, or we live in Gothenburg, or we live in Oslo, or we live anywhere else. And I think that is a perspective as well, that you can't really say that young people from the age of 1 to the age of 30 is some kind of an alienated group of people who are not, who really has the same ideas just because their age.
No, I think we can all agree with that. But I mean, what was just said was that, well, politicians in general, they don't really care what the younger generation thinks because, well, there aren't too many of them and they never vote. The older guys vote. Do you have that practical experience when looking at your colleagues in the parliament?
Not really. We have a saying, and an anonymous member of the Swedish parliament said that it's very important to listen to old voters, but we should always recall that they might be dead to the next election. having that said, with a sense of humor, I think it's also essential to realize that the young people not really are the future, because we know that for sure, and that is some kind of a cliche, but we're also knowing that young people have now a force within them with social media and everything else, making sure that they can really create turmoil and chaos if the older politicians don't listen to them. And I think that social change and social activity is something quite new and something good and vital for the public debate.
Right. We're going to get into technology and social media on the second half of the discussion. But Lucas, I mean, you have all the prerequisites of getting into politics, right? Your family, I mean, your father, all the experience in the world concerning politics. You've worked as a civil servant. You've seen how policy making works. Why don't you want to enter that cycle?
I'll get to that in a second, but first I want to point out that Estonia disproves maybe some assertions or the hypothesis that youth in politics make a big structural change in how politics are run. I mean, we have a country where 2 of the last 2 prime ministers were under 40 when they took office. And if you look at the age of our ministers, many of our MPs, it would appear that we are nirvana when it comes to youth in politics. But does that change our politics in any appreciable way? As a civil servant, I can say that the most youthful ministers that I've worked for in mind were in their 50s and 60s. And they were actually, and this is a question of individuals, they were actually much more open and dynamic than the ministers I've worked for in their 30s.
Who were young, elderly people?
Well, I mean, part of the question is that it's not a question of the youth in politics, it's a question of which youth. And the pipeline we have for politics now is that people join when they're 12, and with all due respect, it's a club, like, in university, you can join the young party, or you can be an athlete, or you can go do something else. And so you have a track of people who are young people in politics, but of course they've been shaped at that by the time they actually say have elected office by being a young party member for 10, 15 years. And maybe they've been shaped less if they become an MP at 30 than if they become an MP at 50, but it's the same basic phenomenon. And so to make this personal, right, for me the heuristic or the question is, how can I actually do something useful in the world? And if anything, being a civil servant for nearly 10 years convinced me that the politicians affect very little, and led me to ask, what are the other ways of doing things in the world that are useful? So for me the choice, after 10 years in civil service was, what do I do next? Politics would have been an option. I decided actually I need to understand how an entrepreneur and a business person do what they do, how you actually change something in the world, worrying about profit and loss, worrying about, having to have your money come from someone being willing to pay for what you're doing as opposed to coming from the tax collector. With the hypothesis that that's a skill set that if I then, the next time around, I think about what to do 5 or 10 years from now, if I want to go into politics, that's a whole new skill set I have. Or to put it differently, if I go back to being a civil servant, I know how to regulate the private sector even harder.
What a nice answer, Glenn. You've been circling in Brussels for ages, yeah. So you have a great experience. I mean, do the leaders who gather there really consider the needs and wishes of the millennials, or is the political reality something completely different?
Well, first of all, I agree with Gustav, who said that he entered as a 12. I was pioneer when I was a 12 in Soviet Union, so I wouldn't either recommend joining a party at 12. And Lucas is certainly on his way, as he said, it's just another step, the private sector. But I think in Estonia there's no particular need to cross over from one to the other, and politics is becoming younger. Look, President Macron is a good example. It's becoming younger also in let's put it that way, traditional democracies, and perhaps politics is becoming more interesting in the sense that parties are a limiting factor based on very strict worldview and voting patterns and whipping and all that.
Take the mic, Glenn. Platform
type of democracy is perhaps much more interesting. That is now emerging. Five-Star Movement, En Marche. So I think also due to technology, politics is changing, the communication infrastructure is changing, so it changes much more. And I don't know a single politician that ignores public opinion, at least in democracies. I mean, even I think in autocracies, they do ignore, but eventually it will come to haunt you, and it will bite in usually 4 years' time. So you don't have perhaps time to tap into and work with the public opinion being in a coalition, but that's how cycles change also in democracy. So once you fall into opposition, that's time to reconnect. So this is it's a great thing in democracy.
So even though the elderly politicians would like to ignore what, let's say, the younger population thinks, technology makes it impossible, basically.
I think democracy is a good way. There's no right and wrong in terms of redistributionary politics. So that's why I'm always been of mind that social policy should be very close to citizens and linked to. And I wouldn't want to Europeanize it, because there's no right and wrong. It's a redistributionary issue. And I agree with the first speaker on taking also structural measures to incentivize, because the older are becoming older. People were dead probably last century at my age already. So 15 was midlife crisis. I mean, I'm now in one, and I hope at least I'm not only even halfway through. So it changes, and we need to adapt, and we need to bring young people also to adapt democracy to the changing needs, because technological revolution is changing it a lot, and we need to bring young people because we need to understand it, how this new thing works.
Right. Well, I guess that concludes the introductory part from the panel. We got to know what the panel thinks. And now I want to understand what do you guys think of the first 3 questions that were up on WorksUp. So can we project the answer to the first question, do you follow politics and events related to the EU? 89% follow it, and 11% don't know if they follow it, and 0 said no. We have
the politics follows them.
Very well-informed crowd here. Let's look at the second question. Do you believe that you are able to influence EU decision-making? Who said what? On the screens in a second, I guess. Right, so 53% think that yes, they can influence EU decision-making, 32 said no, and 16 said not sure, or I don't know. Right, well that also shows something. And the third question was, do you feel that the EU needs a change? Let's see what you guys thought about that. Right, most of you think that the EU needs a change. 19% are happy with the EU as it is, and 14% don't really know if the EU needs a change. Well, good to know, good to know. We're going to move forward with the panel, and ladies and gentlemen, just to encourage you to be active. You can also, be active in an analog, old-school way, raising your hand and really letting me know that you want to ask a question. I'm not gonna see that immediately, but if you do that long enough, I'm sure I'm gonna get your question to the panel. Let's move on with one of my questions. So it seems to me that the youth are no longer like traditionally voting for the left, and then when they grow up, they become more conservative. If you look at a poll conducted less than a year ago in Estonia, the right-wing nationalist party EKRE was the most popular party among the youth. And I was surprised by that because, I traditionally considered youth being left-wing punk, hippie, whatever. Anyway, everything else but conservatives. And I want to understand, why is that the case? So maybe Kristen, you can try to help me on that to start off. Why do the young people like conservatives these days?
I don't think it's an easy question to answer because I don't think I know fully the answer to that question. But I think one kind of element to it is the fact that politics, as usual, is not something that appeals to people. So if something is different, it's more bold. That tends to be something that kind of can bring in people who weren't interested before, can bring in people who felt that politics wasn't speaking to them before. So I think there's that element to it because, yes, in Estonia, there are some statistics about the EKRE, yet I think it's also exciting to see that in other parts of Europe we can see the Green Party having similar level of popularity, especially if we look at the last European Parliament elections as well. Our Green Party isn't quite to that level to get that excitement out of people. I've spoken to many friends who say that they would love for us to have the kind of Green Party that exists, let's say, in Germany, and they would vote for it as well. So I think people are looking for an alternative. They're looking for a different kind of politics, and the impression is that these parties offer that, and that's why they are drawn to it.
Gustav, what do you think? I mean, what does the Swedish example tell us?
Well, I agree with that of young people wanting an alternative. And looking at the Swedish example, it was 5 or 6 or 7 years ago we had a centre-right government in Sweden, and we had government ministers claiming that they were feminists, and that was really astonishing within the Conservative Party I represent. And then we had ministers saying that they didn't really want more private alternatives when it came to the social sector, which was quite astonishing as well, because at that time in Sweden we had some kind of a leftist trend. It was popular to be involved in environmentalist policies, which has historically been seen as more left-leaning trends. And now we have a conservative trend after that. So I think that if we meet here in 5 years, we will discuss the ongoing trends of liberal policies or of left policies again, because I believe that these things go in trends. One thing that I really have noticed in Sweden is that we have a lot of young politicians and a lot of young people claiming to be conservative, but when you talk policy with them and when you discuss, they are not conservative at all. They dress conservative, they want to be stay-at-home moms, they adore the Swedish king, and they do all these typical conservative things because they want to have the personal lifestyle of conservatism, but they are not really advocating conservative policy. The Swedish support for abortion legislation is an all-time high, so you don't see any conservative backlash on that. And we had Stockholm Pride last week, which was a huge example of hundreds of thousands of people walking in Stockholm celebrating these rights. So I would say that it is also some kind of a personal being rebellistic actions when it comes to many Swedes being conservative right now.
So being a conservative is considered rebel in Sweden these days?
Absolutely, because you are rebel. You're some kind of a rebel towards the grown-ups, the establishment, the trending policies which has been shaping Swedish politics for the last 10-15 years. So of course they see themselves that I would say it's quite stupid. It is very stupid.
You're not doing it out from rebellion.
No. I'm convinced by heart conservative, and I was conservative also when it wasn't popular, not even within my own party. But I would say that it's more these days a personal statement rather than a political idea that are symbolizing these conservative trends.
So Glenn so what do you guys think? I mean, where have the moderate parties actually gone wrong? I mean, Glenn and Lucas, what happened for what was the reason why we see this trend for conservative values these days? I mean, was there too much openness, too much liberal values, too little explanation, too little understanding in let's say in our region, because we were like going in one direction as a society, and then suddenly it seemed like there was this stop and turn. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think liberal democracy's success is also that it is a conservative as well as social democratic value. So probably we should speak of the liberal democratic values versus anything else that is there. So I wouldn't say that the conservatives versus, I mean, EPP type of Christian Democrats are very much liberal, pro-liberal democracy. I think there's an element, obviously, for young people being rebel, and that's a normal way of life. So I think there's obviously an argument in that of being rebellious. Secondly, I think a well-done job was done in mobilizing them. I suppose I don't have very clear evidence, but I suppose there's an element of technology in there. Usually catching up political movements are much better at deploying unusual ways of mobilizing people. Probably it's also because of some of the issues of fear were captured very well. And I think there are also substantive issues of in a society that were perhaps ignored by some of the political forces that are out there, especially perhaps the income gap and equality and things like that, which usually mobilize things. So perhaps young people also looked at their parents' livelihoods, etc., and went to the polls and said, enough of it. I don't like it. So democracy is a great thing of correcting things. So it's also a correction. I'm pretty sure of that.
Lucas, is that a correction, and will we see a shift of trend in 5 years?
Well, let's put yourself in the minds of maybe a couple of different types of young voters who see themselves, for whom it makes sense, perhaps counter to our intuitions, to vote for a far-right party. The first group maybe doesn't feel that it makes much of a difference, and they've lived in a liberal democracy their entire life. Whatever changes it is that this party is claiming to bring, they certainly don't see that these changes are going to fundamentally alter the society they live in. And so they say, well, why the hell not? Because they're getting bombarded by this party's Facebook advertisements, memes, 4chan, Twitter, board posts, etc. What's to be lost? There is also a subset of people that I think Glenn talked about who aren't happy. We assume that youth equals kind of happy, educated, cosmopolitan people, and that certainly isn't the case. And there's no age limit on living out, an Estonian living outside of Tallinn and Tartu, feeling that things aren't going terribly well and wanting a change and being worried about the future. That can be true for a 25-year-old in the countryside as much as it's true for a 65-year-old in the countryside. I think the interesting question is whether in those countries where the vote actually has led to a policy change, whether the subset of the youth who didn't really care about the change. Because I think there's two groups, right? There's a group that says, something needs to change, I'm substantively not happy with politics, and they might be very happy with this. And there's the other group that was basically trolling politics. Whether the group that's trolling politics continues with that if it turns out that there are consequences to trolling politics. And the last point is just maybe a statistical quibbling or two. Yes, among a certain age bracket, ECRA had a plurality of youth support. That's not the same thing as having a majority. And the numbers are very different across countries. I mean, if you go to the US, sure, you will find young MAGA Trump supporters, but Democrat versus Republican preferences there skew very strongly with the youth being Democrats. So, but it's also clear in the US that voting for the right has an impact, that elections are close, and so if you vote a certain way because you're trying to troll, well, you end up trolling yourself.
Interesting. Everyone in the audience, have I ignored you? I mean, do you have questions? Do you want to... Oh, I see a hand going up there. Where is the microphone? I'm not really sure about that. Do we have a mic for the gentleman over there? Or will we do it without a mic and I'm just going to repeat the question to the microphone? Okay, sir, please ask your question. I'm going to repeat it for those of who... Yeah.
As you see, I've been young for a very long time. I agree, conservatism is now, as it was when I was young, in the Thatcher days, it is the ultimate expression of rebellion. And it's young people you saw in the Brexit campaign are divided between those who are essentially obedient and those who are essentially rebellious. And it's a strange phenomenon. The way I'd interpret what you're saying now is that young people today are in a way different from how they have been before. And it mystifies you that they're not left-wing. The mystery is that they're not rebellious. That they are in many ways obedient, or they are categorised as being obedient. And this we saw in Brexit, that young people were meant to vote for the European Union. But the rebellion is, and I think in a way it's a rebellion against the whole way of thinking of this, is that young people should be categorised as a class. Because that, they understand, is a mechanism of making them more obedient. It says that your interests as a young person are fundamentally different to the interests of your parents. And people instinctively understand this is the way of dividing me from my parents. And when they see, with ECRA or with Brexit, that their parents are the rebellious class and they are the obedient class, not only are they embarrassed about it, but they understand there is something fundamentally wrong in that.
Right. Do you have a question, or was that the comment?
Well, it's a comment, but I'm trying to pose it as a question because I'm trying to interpret what you're saying, but in a different way. That when you said you started like your political life as a young pioneer,
it wasn't a political life. I'm just saying that I was on my way to a party.
But those, I think those young people who are supporting ECRA, that's how they see it. They see that they're being told what to think, to be a young pioneer for the EU or for whatever it is they're supposed to think, and they say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do the defiant thing. And to be, as you said, to be a conservative is the new punk.
Right. Any more questions or comments from the audience? Now, as we have a microphone, it makes things much easier. A lady in the left here.
Thank you. I have a question regarding those mobile young people who are actually moving around Europe and living in different countries. As you can see, I'm representing one of the initiatives here in Estonia that e-governance Academy is implementing. So the question is, do you think that those mobile youth can play some role in strengthening Europe, so to say, maybe in strengthening the value of European citizenship, so to say? Maybe they are the key in battling the European skepticism, or in battling the extremists' views, so to say, in Europe. Because we know they're moving around, we know they're coming to different countries, and if they are important, do you think that the countries in the European Union, the states, can make something in order to make them feel more welcomed, so to say? We are working on different recommendations how to make them feel more integrated in Estonia. And do you think that this is something to be done by countries in the European Union?
So did I understand the question correct? Can mobile EU citizens change attitudes in Europe?
Are they generally important, and can they strengthen Europe overall? And if so, what can we do to support this?
Right.
So
well, go ahead, guys. Who wants to answer that?
Well, generally, I think all the programs such as Erasmus are the best known in Europe. I think the older generation, especially in our country, has missed out because we joined Union in 2004. So a large part of society, perhaps we would need to have Erasmus for elderly people. In general, I think the cultural exchange and traveling is pretty good against all sorts of biases against any sort of neighbor, even within your own country. So go for it.
So one question I would ask when you say mobile youth, I mean, Glenn, you have one image of mobile youth, which is university students spending a semester somewhere else. But I think the single largest group of mobile youth in the EU were relatively young Poles, Romanians, Lithuanians going to do labor in the UK. So clearly that integration project didn't work out perfectly because that was one of the motivators for a lot of Brexit voters. So I don't know if that's a constructive answer, but I think that we have to kind of, when we say mobile youth, we have to be clear on who and what we're talking about. It's not just this one group. The group I think that Glenn's talking about, part of the issue though is, I mean, these are people who anyways are educated and cosmopolitan in their outlook, so probably their views on the EU were fairly positive before they undertook their mobility. And they're probably going to interact mostly with people in universities or certain types of employers who might also share those views. So it's not clear how much, what portion of, say, mobile youth of that group in the EU, if they say come to Estonia, are going to end up outside of Tallinn and Tartu.
Gustav.
I think that the integration of Europe and having young Europeans going to different countries to work or to study is fundamental. It's beautiful. It's great. However, I think it's quite dangerous to say that the Erasmus program and everything else serves as trying to make these young Europeans as ambassadors for an idea of European identity or European values. That is first and foremost quite a paternalistic way of looking at young people. And I would say also it's very difficult to try to define these European values, because I would say that my definition of European values is not the same as the Viktor Orban would define European values or European identity and so on. So I think it's very good that we have that discussion about it, but I'm not really sure that the way forward is to say that we need to have more European integration because we need to have more European common values, because then we can end up in a direction which is very, very different to the so-called values we have today on a common ground.
I'll just say a few things actually about Erasmus. It's not just for university students, it's a much broader program than that, but everybody knows the university part the most. But it actually does include far more young people and has wider programs. But I'll say that the Erasmus program, we've had it for 30 years now. And I mean, now we're having serious debates about the European identity and does it exist and what is the European Union. And so then we can ask, well, has it been successful when we're now having this crisis? I like the program, but there's also serious concerns of, is it actually working in a way many people hope it is? I hope we continue, and maybe the problem is that it doesn't have sufficient funding, that not enough people get to do this program. So there are many questions there.
Yeah, actually, it might have been a year ago when this person approached me and saying that we really have a problem in Estonia, that we don't really have enough applicants to take on these Erasmus scholarships. So maybe not everyone wants to go. And we actually had, at one point, I think we actually had more people wanting to come to Estonia than to go from Estonia to other countries. So Erasmus discussion, interesting one. But let's move on with climate, which kind of proves the opposite from what we started off saying, that the youth don't really care about politics. The youth seem to care a lot about climate. But to understand, again, the position of the audience, can I ask you again to go to Worksup, enter the event ID? But I mean, if you're already there, you don't have to do that. And there's a question about climate, a relevant question these days for politicians and decision makers. And the question is, should the EU achieve climate neutrality by 2050? Yes, no, I don't know. Go ahead, pick your answer, and I'm going to ask pretty much the same question from the panel here. So, I mean, Glenn, the political reality is not really clear, is it, among the EU leaders? I mean, there was a failed attempt to sign a document. Where do you actually see this going? Will we have that signature, this this decision to have climate neutrality by 2050? Or where are the problems? What's stopping us?
First, I still take the opportunity to answer the last thing on diversity question, and I'd say diversity is a core European value. The fact that we accept each other's difference, you don't have that anywhere. So this is why European values are so hard to define, because diversity is the core European value. But on climate change, there are quite many dimensions to it. First of all, I think it was a little bit overplayed in domestic media, because it was a concern, and we are undergoing a serious study on how to do this. And putting an aim somewhere without knowing what the social cost or economic cost or ecological cost and what do we need to do, And following that type of herd instinct, I would say would have been wrong. So in that instance, I wouldn't put the discussion over climate change, which we are now to have in September, and the study being commissioned by Stockholm Environment Institute about Estonia being ready, I think, in 2 weeks. I think that's the right way to go. We should also tell people what this will take. What does this really mean? It really means a big, big change. I was just coming from another debate on science, and I mean, it's an enormous change. Only in energy, in transport, the way we live, the way of mobility. It's just easy to say, let's do this. Why 100? Why not 150, 200%? But it's an enormous change. But there is also an opportunity. So everybody understands if we take the opportunity, we might actually be big winners, especially on the technology, labor, etc. side, the ones who adapt first. And it's also a big ethical question. It's because fundamentally it's a question about us, because we are the problem. We, the humans, are the problem.
Lucas, I mean, we all know Greta Thunberg, who sparked a popular movement. On September the 20th, there's going to be a massive protest. I mean, where do you see this debate really going? Is the gap between the youth and this real politic, is it just enlarging? Will we see more protests, or is that debate actually like moving the planet forward?
Well, I don't know where it's fundamentally going to go. I think that there are probably two issues where, if you were trying to identify a collective youth position, probably they're the future of our social systems and climate, where you have these questions of intergenerational equity. So if you're going to have a youth position, and it's never going to be 100% of the youth, but you're going to have a clear skew, it's going to be on climate, it's going to be on pensions and questions like this. I think one of the challenges in a place like Estonia right now is to think about how youth can also work through other channels than just politics in the narrow sense. So what can our companies do to actually explain what we might be able to do to change our behavior patterns? How can NGOs fill that gap in? I mean, it's clear that if we want to have the herd mentality of the herd keeping itself alive, in that sense herd mentalities are good, herds like to not be killed off, we have to sort of do something, and that something shouldn't just be limited to what we do through formal political processes. Ultimately, you do need to have the legislation, the framework in place, because we basically have to artificially increase the cost of carbon, and that's going to work through regulatory mechanisms. But in fleshing out how we do that and what the possibilities are, and in a country like Estonia changing the debate, I think maybe the message isn't just that the youth politicians need to do something, but it's the 30-year-old head of strategy in a tech company, or the 30-year-old head of an NGO, doing the hard exercise of thinking, well, what can my organization, what can I do where I'm sitting right now to actually help to that process? And perhaps that's the youth engagement we need as much as anything else, so that the political decision, when it gets made, is one that's actually makeable.
Gustav, how has... is she 15 or is she 16, Greta?
She's getting old. She's 16 now.
16, yeah. Okay. How has she changed the political discussion in Sweden?
Well, a year ago, nobody really knew who she was. She started her school strikes outside the Riksdag in Stockholm in August last year, when we had general elections in Sweden. So, of course, now she's met the Pope and everyone else. So, of course, she's a big influencer. And, of course, what she does is tremendously important. One nudging thing I feel about the case of Greta Thunberg, now I'm being very conservative, I apologize for that, is that she hasn't really yet defined, and some would say it is her role, what should be done. Because she's constantly saying we need to listen to scientists. And of course we can listen to scientists, but the problem is that the scientists as a collective, they say a lot of different things. I think that in the climate debate we need to discuss policy, not scare each other with dystopia, but discuss policy and what can concretely be done. Of course, every individual has a big responsibility. I would, however, say that if you look at now around the globe, we see that 1,800 coal power plants are being constructed right now, and in China they are constructing 200 big international airports, which will look like Ringmeedia airport to look quite small in comparison to these 200, 300 airports they're building now in China. We must act collectively on that issue. And we must act collectively on having international framework of the big polluters. But of course, I think that the main contribution that Greta Thunberg has made is that we now discuss it, and that now we discuss these issues in Sweden, for example, in almost every political debate there is, and that is good. But I think there is also some time now for action.
Well, I'll just kind of taking Greta's side in here, in the sense that the problem is that people aren't treating it with the urgency that it should be treated with. Politicians especially, it seems like they're just treating it as any other political challenge. It seems terrifying how quickly everything is changing due to climate change, and it seems like a doomsday is kind of heading our way very, very soon, and everybody's just kind of sitting on it and kind of discussing and coming to an agreement and then going back on it and not really doing anything toward the agreement as well. So it seems just ridiculous. So I think her role is being that person giving the wake-up call and being outraged at this basically inactivity. We're just pretending to do something and we're not, and that's the ridiculous thing. And I feel the same way, and I think she's voicing that thing that many people are feeling.
So Glenn, has she managed to activate leaders in Brussels? I mean, this movement, when we were saying that the politicians cannot ignore public opinion, and when you look at the polls, climate has climbed up tremendously among the priorities that people list when they think about European politics. So when you go to Brussels, I mean, and you've been there a few years now, has the discussion shifted after, well, this movement?
Well, even before Greta started to strike in front of Riksdag, we already have quite ambitious climate goals. So it's 80% by 2050. And I think even more important was the scientific approach, because one thing is obviously a political campaign. You can shift that agenda, and I totally agree with Gustav that it has mobilized people. It has brought there's perhaps a wider impact on young people that they can actually change things. So there might be a good educational angle to it. But it was there before. It's the science has said it. We have had a couple of big climate conferences. There are good signs that we as humans can do things, and the ozone layer protection has been one of the things where over the decades things have started to change for better. But nevertheless, we need to also find answer. Where do we get the energy from? And I don't think people are ready to switch off everything tomorrow for that type of lifestyle change. So we bet on technology. A little bit, but it's going to take also a lifestyle change. And the big change also is there's going to be 10 billion people or 11 billion people on this planet. So this will be fundamentally big. I mean, and they want to eat 3 times a day and have a car or 2 and power in their homes, etc. So that's a big challenge. So in that sense, we need to address it and also find Europe is a good way of actually solving these problems. Technological revolution, the geopolitical shift we are going through, and ecological revolution. These are 3 things Europe really should be focused on now. And I think this is what also not only young people but everyone expects.
You know, just in terms of theories of change, and this comes back to the question of what the role of elected politics is, it's not a consensus game. It's a 50.1% game, which makes it a numbers game. So, I mean, if Greta changes anything, it's that she moves that dial on the 50.1% a little bit. And that might express itself not immediately in how people vote. It can also express itself in consumption preferences and, you know, whether there's demand for greener options. But ultimately, it has to affect that 50.1% and move the dial. That's the measure of whether it's had an impact or not.
I think it's time to see what you guys think about carbon neutrality or climate neutrality. Can we have the poll on the screens? Oh, I think it's pretty clear what the audience wants. 86% of you want the EU to go climate neutral by 2050. I guess you were considering your lifestyle change when you were pressing that A button, thinking about those steaks that you will not eat, of the second car in your household that will have to go, of less Netflix in front of the TV because the TV is just too big and consumes too much energy. Or maybe you didn't. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, do the young people, do the strong voices that are demanding carbon neutral by 2050 or even before, do they actually acknowledge the dramatic shift in lifestyle that it will likely bring? Or is it just like a nice thing to say that I want carbon neutrality without knowing what it will actually take?
I don't think we have a choice, really. Like,
you're ready to give up that steak?
No, I mean, I feel like, to be honest, like, we're not going to have a choice. We're going to have to change things for sure. But maybe to then also reflect on a topic we discussed earlier, I think, you know, when we talk about young people and politics, young people do show that we do things in a different way, right? It's like being a vegetarian, or like eating less meat because of climate change, or it's buying your clothes from secondhand shops, whatever. Like taking your own actions. I think this is something that we do see young people doing, where they feel like they're really making a difference. And there are more who do it, but again, young people are not the homogeneous group, so not all of them do it. Not all of them look at it this way. So yeah, basically, I would like to say, in a way, it's not the relevant question because we don't really have a choice with this. We just have to act and we have to reduce. But the younger generation shows good examples of ways to do it and taking lead. So I'm optimistic about it.
Right. The audience, do you have questions or comments on that? Oh, we do have one white sweater over there with a hand up. Ave, go ahead.
Perhaps to, well, not provoke you, Glenn, but I just wanted to make a comment on the fact that European Union has had all sorts of solutions and maybe some wins also in terms of, you know, policy. And, you know, I can name, for example, the renewable plastics thing. But I think, of course, the change starts from individual level and we all have to do it. But to be honest, like, the real impact would come from the big players making a big impact, but we haven't seen that. We really need to challenge the status quo to actually make a big change, because those small initiatives, even if they have been there for like 10 years or whatnot, they haven't really made an impact that would be urgent enough or, you know, big enough, because, you know, the sense of urgency is there.
Well, can I say that, I mean, just a couple of 100 kilometers from here, the power station has stopped producing electricity. So that's an answer for you. The government is considering how can it work with the miners now. So that's a very, very real impact on Estonian power production. You should look around what the ETS that has been invented to change and bring about the shift in electricity production, industrial production and transport will do. So it has a very, very real change. And the good thing, I'm saying that we cannot coordinate individual level action. Industrial level action we can. And Europe has done some great work. And the problem is that with individual action is that who's going to blink first, because it's a cost issue as well. So if everyone takes the cost and shares an understanding, we can actually achieve that much better rather than Sweden going it alone, because Swedish industry will then suffer, Swedish electricity prices, etc. So if we do it in a coordinated way, we, I think, can achieve that type of challenges much, much better.
You go ahead, Lucas.
Without passing moral judgment, I mean, part of the practical problem you have is that, first of all, Estonia is one of the countries that will be least impacted, right? So the kind of the feedback loop of actions to consequences is weaker here. But let's actually look at a broader paradox. And I say leaving aside the moral justice question, because if you go back into history at who's polluted more, it's a more complex picture. But right now, criticize European leaders as much as you do. They're the ones that globally have been pushing for all the measures that would have impact. maybe they should have been pushing for more, but the difficulties have been getting the US, China, India to sign on, all of which, including the US in particular, are countries that will suffer more. So the paradox we have right now is that Europe, that in aggregate, yes, it will suffer, absolutely, there will be difficulties and dislocations, but actually will suffer less from climate change, is trying to do a whole lot more about it than the rest of the world, which will suffer more. And that leaves aside the moral question of, again, developing countries haven't had the chance to emit as much, so perhaps they can counter with the fairness argument, but the fact of the matter is they're doing less and they'll suffer more.
More questions from the audience? Yep, there's a question over here. Can we get a mic there? Mic's coming.
Hi, I'm Mike.
No, it's over here.
Okay, sorry.
Hi. You made a criticism of Greta's campaign and the climate campaigns around it, which is that it doesn't contain any actionable policy directives. That slightly ignores the extent to which the youth believe that anything that they do that is productive is achieved outside of policy and the very narrow scope of politicians. I apologize for using American polling here. I know it's not European, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that over 2/3 of the youth believe nothing is worth achieving is achieved through the conventional political system. The only way to mitigate against that is to get the youth involved in policy direction, if that's the outcome that you want. How would you suggest that that is achieved? Anyway.
Did you get that?
I didn't really catch how to involve young people in policy.
If the criticism is that the campaigns that the youth care about do not contain actionable policy directives, the only way to mitigate that is to get the youth involved in policy making, which they don't want to do. How do you do that?
It wasn't much of a criticism of the movement. It was more of a criticism of Greta Thunberg, if I were to have one. Because I want to really point it out. I think that she's doing a tremendous job. But if I were to be a bit critical, I would say that it would be better if we came down and talked about concrete reforms. I would say that one thing that my own political party has done in Sweden is that, having a political party as the moderate party where the youth league is bigger than the big party when it comes to membership means that we have a lot of things to say and we have a lot of things to point out when it comes to the internal policy making. That is one way political parties can work. I would say that the European Youth Forums and the European help me with this, the European youth representatives and the youth representatives to the United Nations and everything that we have is also a good way of trying to formalize one way into decision making, but also encourage the movement that we see, because we need more of the Fridays for Future. And I really hope that this movement will continue to grow. But one thing that I hope will come out from this is that instead of having a big news buzz in Swedish newspapers about Greta Thunberg going over the Atlantic Sea in a boat, which really consummated the whole news in Sweden last week of having this boat trip, the gossipy thing around her, I would say that it would be better if we try to bring smart people together and try to focus on how to deal and address the concrete issues. I think that the way she started is very good, but I think that politicians need to do more and to involve young people as well.
Lucas?
Just ultimately from a private sector company perspective, because we talk about the Green New Deal and we talk about the big R&D that needs to happen, the thing you really want is certainty that the demand's actually going to be there. And as I said before, the issue is that the demand is artificial in the sense that you need to raise the cost of carbon, right? And this is the big picture of what we need to do. We know. I mean, we've had the Kyoto Protocol for a long time. We've had international agreements where we know it was agreed, and we know it was set out to be agreed, and we kind of know what we weren't able to agree to, but what we should be doing. So where actually someone like Greta Thunberg helps, even if she doesn't have specific proposals, because those specific proposals are already out there, if she helps create an environment where a company might think, well, this isn't just a couple of politicians, this has broader support. give them some kind of confidence that this might actually translate into political change, which makes it more worthwhile for them to actually spend time on thinking, well, what can I do now to get ahead of this trend? Because what you really want is you want everyone to think it's inevitable that we're going to have the political pressure to do something, so I might as well get on board now. So if she can do something to make it more inevitable, that's great. But of course, that brings us back to the 50.1% question.
I'm just curious, how has this debate, or if this debate has changed your mind about the 2015 climate goal? So can I ask the kind technicians to put that question again on Works Up? So the question is, should the EU achieve climate neutrality by 2050? I mean, I'd be very happy if you answered that again. And those of you who have changed your minds, go ahead and do that. Those of you who still think that's the case, that'd be good to know. Let's move on with technology. It has slipped through the debate several times already, talking about democracy in a digital era where people consume their news via social networks, and that's something that's been puzzling me for a while. Something that I can't really answer on my own is this fundamental question about freedom of speech and the responsibility of platforms. And I want to ask you guys, what do you think? I mean, how do democracies survive in the era of internet and social networking? I mean, should we regulate those platforms where people are consuming this information more? I mean, as we are, let's say, regulating, I don't know, we were discussing before about nuclear energy, right? As we are regulating all those atoms that are radioactive. I mean, maybe a bad comparison. But let's say, should Facebook have a responsibility of the content that is up there? Gustav, what do you think?
Well, my spine reaction is to say that I think that all legislation should be tech neutral, because trying to regulate and subsidize and legislate when it comes to tech platforms would be devastating, since tech platforms tend to develop quite faster than legislation processes do. I would say that the main interest from my perspective is that we have a European solution to this problem and to this issue. I'm not sure how this would look. I'm not sure how it would act. I'm not sure how it would be. But I think that having these new trends that we're seeing, the only solution to it is to have legislation which is, in the best of worlds, totally global. But since we don't live in the best of all worlds, I think the solution would be European legislation for it.
Right. Glenn, I think it's fair to say that we might not have Brexit if there wasn't Facebook, or it would have turned out perhaps differently. Would you agree with that? And could you... Yeah, I know you watched a good series recently, or a good documentary. Talk about that.
Well, I think the argument is there on technology, and I wouldn't say Facebook was Facebook only leaked the client data. It was the Cambridge Analytica that made the personnel profiles and ad targets, and also then you deployed Facebook as a technology to deliver a very personalized message, and obviously, with artificial intelligence, with voice, picture, etc., being also quite human-like, let's put it that way. This will change politics, but I think the technology itself is perhaps not so important. It's important, but it's what it does and what it does to the society. And we come from industrial society, very hierarchical. We have parties, we have governments, parliaments, media, Fifth Freedom, etc. are part of that, and this reflects the communication infrastructure of society. In technology, you have something which is called Conway law. And the Conway law will say that the society or something we will build will reflect the communication architecture. So the platform thing is not hierarchical. It's community to community. And it has enormously empowered the voiceless. So technology was one of the things, but it also has empowered a bit of society that didn't have a voice. So there are also real issues about it. I think the I don't know, the purity of the original state of the inventors of internet, that, you know, they imagined a very different way of society coming along with it, and the freedom that comes with it. Technology is a two-way sword. You can do good with it and you can do bad with it. It's dependent on the intentions, and I don't think technology is ready. I mean, it's self-conscious in that way. So it depends what you want to do with it, and then do. So probably there needs to be a regulation, like Gustav said, and probably at the European level.
Right, yeah, exactly. I'm tempted to talk about that side of the sword that gives us fake news. I mean, as it is an emotional issue, often a fearful message, it just gets blown up on Facebook and on social media. I mean, you're dealing with technology on your daily basis. What do you think? Do we need a regulation to really regulate this thing?
Let me give you a less philosophical answer, right? And let's talk about concrete particulars. Europe and the US, in the end of the 90s, the early 2000s, engaged in an experiment where we said we would treat a whole bunch of different types of websites, businesses as mere intermediaries. And we created a legal framework around that. And the issue isn't in the abstract, was that a good idea or a bad idea? At the time, it was a good idea. It's brought a lot of benefits. Let's bring it down to concrete companies, right? Because it may or may not be that there are abstract forces of the market that would make what Facebook did inevitable. But the fact of the matter, very concretely, is that Facebook, Twitter, and a few other companies had specific executives who had specific information at specific points in time about the risks that they were dealing with, the amount of energy they were putting into supervision of what was going on or not, and they were saying publicly, trust us, you don't need to regulate this, we got it, but then they didn't. And they weren't doing the things that were within their power as operators of these private companies, in a way no different from an editor operating a newspaper that, you know, who at the same time has to deal with both the editorial side and the advertising side. They made certain choices, they ran their companies in certain ways, and they had deleterious effects. So we can imagine an alternate universe in which the people running Facebook, Twitter, and a few other companies took a different approach to their responsibility, and within the freedom they had legally to run their company as they saw fit, crafted one type of ecosystem. And maybe bits of what we have would have happened anyway, and bad things with fake news could have happened, but perhaps there wouldn't have been the data leaks that we had, perhaps there wouldn't have been foreign money advertising, perhaps you wouldn't have been able to carry out the micro-targeting, and we'd be having a different discussion. So I think this abstract discussion, how do we regulate internet companies, that was a theoretical discussion we could have in 2000 with theoretical general hypotheses. Now we have concrete evidence on how it's turned out, and the fact of the matter is that the regulatory approach we took had negative approaches. And let's not say that it's, do we regulate them or not? We currently regulate them. We gave them a regulatory opt-out to a lot of rules. Now maybe we should reevaluate that. I don't think we throw out the baby with the bathwater, and there's this question of where do we draw the boundaries, because if we take the legal fiction that both the EU and the US created, where these companies are mere conduits, and we get rid of it together, then yes, a lot of internet-based business falls apart. Maybe we don't use media regulation. Maybe it's about competition law. Maybe it's about liability law. Maybe it's about just having Facebook follow some of the rules on foreign interference and foreign funding of advertising for elections that other media companies have to follow. But something has to change, and it's perfectly appropriate for lawmakers to say, well, we tried one approach, it didn't work, let's try another.
Is Facebook a media company?
I would say yes, because let's turn it around. For them not to be a media company, they really would need to not understand what was going on, right? The differences between Facebook and an ISP, where the ISP really says, I get bits and bytes and I deliver you your bits and bytes. Facebook knows a whole lot about the bits and bytes. They do a whole lot to optimize what happens with those bits and bytes. They may not be a media company to the same extent that Estonian Public Broadcasting is or that Postimees is, but they certainly, if the measure of whether you're a media company is whether you're making editorial decisions or you're thinking about editorial content and running your business based on that, I'd say they are. In the same way that Google, there's certainly the part of Google that runs YouTube is. I mean, YouTube hires artists, hires media editors to craft content. That's what a media company does.
I mean, how far from the political reality is I mean, how far are we from that moment where Facebook in the EU level is treated as a media company with the same regulations, Glenn? I mean, is that debate moving into that direction, or is Facebook still like a neutral platform that has some rules, but nothing comparable to the ones that the media companies have to abide by?
I think there are two things. One of the, as Luca said, there are many layers. One is the media law and audiovisual media services. I'm sure that's been treated, but I don't think it's yet media. What Lucas was referring to was the rather commercial regulation, which says that we're just a platform. Today, it has an opt-out which is unlinked to the content, so it's not responsible for content, and that's gonna change. I'm pretty much, and that's also not only Facebook, but the second biggest, or even the bigger advertising company, which is Google, and its analytic tools, etc. So, and perhaps Amazon in the future.
This is in the pipeline. I mean, in Brussels, this is in the pipeline. You think the next commission will do something about that?
Pretty sure it will, and I would encourage you to read. The French commissioned a study on media law and technology, and I think there's a lot of in it that's probably also being pushed by the French government in the future, which doesn't take a European approach, by the way, which says that we need to do, because democracy happens locally, we need to do it locally. But it has a lot of good analysis in it. And the other thing I've read with great interest was the Information Commissioner's Office in UK has done some great research after Brexit referendum on the technology and democracy. They are really, really good, so do read them.
Right. Christian, what do you think? What potential do you see when we look at the other side of the sword? We've been talking about fake news, and I think most of you agree that something needs to be done on the EU level to stop that. But digital democracy, I mean, it doesn't only have to be bumped up fake news. This could also be taking input from citizens via using all the digital channels, all the platforms, all the apps that we have to communicate with people. I mean, we live in the internet. Is this that you see great potential, unused potential, perhaps, for modern democracy?
I think so. I mean, my background is working for a pan-European NGO that had many member organizations and ultimately hundreds of millions of members indirectly represented. So it ended up being that we could work very efficiently and very inclusively in our work, even ensuring democracy within our organization and being able to get views into our work and our research from different countries around Europe, making us actually representative in what we do. So in practice, it's very possible, and there are great tools that are available to us today.
Beppe Grillo's using them in Italy with his 5-star movement. Is that a good example?
I mean, Glenn started with this. You know, you can use it for anything. It's down to the people who use it. You know, internet as such isn't good or bad. It's down to what we make of it. I tend to see more of the good sides. But I met people who think all social media is bad, period, and there's no further discussion. I don't think it's to that level. I think it's brought many great things. Many people can watch us online right now. They can hear this discussion from their couch at home or wherever they're traveling for holidays. I wouldn't want to give that up, and even my European identity is based on the fact that I can discuss with people all over Europe. And I mean, if we make friends today, you know, we could keep chatting on WhatsApp forever. So I think there's a lot of hope and great things in it there.
But I mean, taking input from citizens via digital channels. I mean, Gustav, what do you think of the experiment that the 5-star movement in Italy is doing, where they claim this is a modern democracy? This is how parties or political movements, these days they don't consider themselves as a party, this is how they should build up their ideology. This is how they should develop their programs, getting direct feedback from the citizens via the digital channels. Do you think that's a viable solution? That's the future of democracy?
Well, I think that the Italian government has resigned today, right?
Yeah, that's Yeah.
Well, so no, but I think that that is of course one way to do it, and of course one way in order to try to develop your policy and being very, very down to earth and grassroots rule and everything. I think that they miss one fundamental point when it comes to politics, and politics is about values and ideology. And of course, there's a lot of values and ideologies in a country, and of course, it's impossible to combine all of them. And at the end, I think that it will only be messy. But of course, you can be very, very short time successful with having these kinds of instruments. But I don't think it's successful in the long run.
Glenn?
What I wanted to add was that when I a little bit studied the Brexit case in depth, also the science behind it, including the psychological profiling, etc. What was really valuable, what was of course a media platform for targeting ads and reaching people, but the real value is in data. And we with Lucas have thought a lot about the European digital single market and how to put that data to use for new business models and better products European companies can have. But we haven't given a lot of thought in the data we have in the government databases for politics, because this would also be a way of making that available on a level playing field, because the problem with Brexit was actually non-level playing field. One party had access, huge amount of data, and the other party didn't. We need to find a way of level playing field, giving all political movements that are recognized as parties access to that data, and knowing not at the personal level, at the personal data level, but in the problems level, because we can have a lot of data out of what we have, the health information, the works information, the education information, what the problems really are and what the solutions could be. So we need to find a way to data to give actually access of political parties to it as a resource, because we control media as a resource for politicians, because that's an important way of reaching citizens. We treat money in political campaigns. We should also treat data in political campaigns and see that none of the players have an advantage in terms of having a huge client database with much of the data illegally gathered about the citizens, but actually everybody had a data to it and then run a campaign and get more knowledge about the country they live, the problems we have, and the solutions also we have, because we have enormous amount of data also as a government. We haven't figured that angle out.
Right, guys. Do you have questions or comments concerning democracy in a digital era? Either be it on the fake news side, or direct democracy, or using free movement of data as an equal platform for all? Nope, I don't think so. No? All cool? No questions? Okay. Can we see what you guys thought about the climate question before we move forward? Oh, you see? This debate actually changed something. So the political reality seems to have hit you. 80% of you answered that yes, the EU should be climate neutral by 2050. I think that was 94% before, right?
I think the dinner is cancelled, right? So no dinner today.
Yeah, no? And 20 says no. Right, so well, we don't know how many of you answered before and this time, but I mean, maybe that shows something.
So basically we had a realistic discussion and we quashed everyone's optimism, or at least some of the optimism in the room.
Isn't that sad?
Not again.
Right, guys. I mean, we could pick another topic because I mean,
I have just an observation, and this is a meta point, right? But it's something that's been bothering me is that we're a pretty crappy youth panel, and in two ways, right? One is that I don't know everyone's age here, but I know Glenn is over 30. I know I'm over 30, and we don't have anyone under 20, right? So we don't have, my sister's 9th grade compatriots who I think 5 out of 8 that she did an informal survey of wanted to vote for ECRA and who aren't thinking about politics. And then we also have 4 people who are in one way or another part of the elite, who are active in politics, who are civil servants, who used to be civil servants and now work in a company in a sort of white-collar position, who are running civil society movements. We're not emblematic of the disaffected youth. So, I mean, if we're going to have in the future a panel about youth and politics, we literally need to go and grab a PIDA teenager, maybe someone who speaks English, but frankly Estonians have some of the best English in Europe, so that shouldn't be a problem, and find a way to bribe them to be here for an hour and a half and give honest answers, because I think that might give us some more insight into the mythical youth than 4 unrepresentative samples.
As someone who's worked for a youth movement, I've been to so many events and panels where there's no young people discussing about young people. We're a bit better than those panels, I would say. But you're right, like, if you want to talk about young people, you need to talk with young people, and they need to be at the table for sure.
Right. One more topic in this already vivid mixture of different ideas is, let's talk, I mean, when we're talking about technology, it's clear that the future of the labor market is somewhat different than what we've grown used to. Now, this was one of the topics we discussed with you over the phone that is actually a problem for the youth, or is an important issue for the youth. So let's bring that on for the last 10 minutes of our discussion. I mean, how do you think, how will the app economy change the careers of tomorrow? What are the problems that you actually see there? I mean, is social tax one of the words that we should talk about?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the bigger questions of what are the social security systems in place now with our interesting new jobs, driving Ubers or Bolts or whatever else there is, and how do we catch up with that? I don't know what the progress on the European pillar on social rights, is that the right way to say it?
Yeah, we can check that with Glenn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's a major question of how will, those people who are not contributing towards their pensions now, who might not have health care, how do we adapt to this new type of work? Really?
Companies not paying tax.
Exactly.
So what do you do about that? I mean, yeah.
I think it's part of the issue with this question is it has the extent to which it's a problem really varies by country. And I think it's less of an issue in Estonia, for instance, where because we basically designed our social system later, it's less dependent on companies, right? It's more straightforward to be a sole proprietor, to pay your social tax, to contribute to your pension. It's not perfect, and people have a short-term incentive, perhaps not to do that, but it's not as big a challenge for Estonia to adjust its pension and various welfare state provisions to work with this. In fact, it's much more just an enforcement question of applying the current legislation than it is for a country where healthcare and pensions really go through employers. And that comes back to the broader youth unemployment question, where it becomes a huge equity question in a country like Italy that has not been able to carry out structural reforms in how its labor market works. But a lot of youth unemployment as a question isn't a separate political issue in many countries in Europe because youth do fairly decent jobs at getting work. And I mean, if I look at the app economy in Estonia, I admit I don't have the numbers, but if I look sort of purely, and this is purely experiential, right? If I look at the average age of an Uber driver in Brussels, where I lived for 4 years, versus the average age of an Uber or a Taxify driver in Estonia, I don't see it as a youth issue in Estonia. I mean, there may be some issues with making sure that people who are working for the app economy are paying their social taxes, but it's probably more of an issue for the 55-year-old who maybe is not making the right pension contributions, versus in Paris or in Brussels, where it really is young people who are taking these jobs for lack of other opportunities. So I think it's one of those issues, as a lot of other, before we had climate come as a political issue, and people talked about youth political issues, they talked about a lot of pseudo issues that were more reflections of the fact that the welfare state in southwestern Europe, and I guess that includes France, and so on, really hadn't modernized itself. But that wasn't a youth issue. That was a can't reform your welfare state issue that happened to impact youth a lot.
Glenn, how's the social pillar doing?
I'm the fact check guy.
Yeah, the political reality check guy.
Okay, one of the most interesting books I've read lately was Shoshana Zuboff's book about surveillance capitalism, and she makes a point. Over technology's impact in the overall welfare and social model, and she basically says that that digital technology capitalism, which we are pretty much living now, is going to break the labor relations, because the industrial model of society is built on labor relations. So we have democratic model, which is a correction mechanism, but we have also trade unions talking to industry. There is no need for trade unions for digital technology. So it will break a social model, and that will be the real fundamental problem of redistribution and welfare society. So that's her bottom line. I think there's certainly a point in there. Not only the democratic issue, the disruption but we are living a general purpose technologies revolution. So it will change the economy model. Second point, I think, from the European point of view and the social model point of view, that again, we've worked with Lucas a lot on the digital single market, so on the upside of that technology, so generating a big market, having a lot of opportunities in a single market for companies to operate, and then obviously compete with China and US. I think with this legislative cycle, we're moving towards the issues of digital taxation, because I think socially is not acceptable that the business advantage has been got through the not paying taxes. I think everybody accepts the basic fact that if you have a better business model, it's all right. But if mom and dad's shop will have to pay taxes and the internet company doesn't have to, it's not a fair competition. And this is a fundamental issue in a society. Second of all, I think the platform workers will be in the scope of work. They will be called workers. The business model cannot be that the taxi companies pay social tax and the platform companies will not. So I'm sure this issue will be addressed, because this issue will end up in a ballot box. These guys were voting for Brexit, were voting for radical forces in society, because radical forces tap into that left behind force. We need to reconnect with that and see that this model of our society still works.
Gustav, you agree with that?
To some extent, yes. But I would say one observation from Sweden is that if we look at Uber, for example, and looking also at the 163,000 refugees my country took in 2015, which I must admit was a good decision by my government to do. Coming
from a conservative, you heard that?
A conservative who has been arrested in Kampala for gay rights.
Right. So well, that is a rebel thing in Sweden.
That's really rebellious. 163,000 refugees in 2015, many of whom have been working as Uber drivers. And the alternative to that is to not work at all, which would lead to further government government spending and subsidies and everything else. So, of course, it's not good if you're really fond of the traditional labor market systems, and it's not good to have these revolutionary models coming through and no politicians or no legislators really know how to deal with it. But I think for the ordinary men and women working with these issues and working as Uber drivers, this has been the really alternative of them of not having a job at all, and that has also led to a very good integration in Sweden. So of course I can see that the app-driven economy is very good and has served as a very good role model for integration processes when it comes to refugees.
Mm-hmm. Well, just in response to the stories, obviously that's one side, and I'm all for that. You know, people like me, if I want, can drive at the evening for 1 hour and or 2 hours and make some extra money, etc. Part-time job. But I've read a very interesting piece in Estonian news media about the taxi driver, how his work has changed over the last 3 years. He has turned from a worker into an entrepreneur, not paying taxes anymore, no working regulation, no timing, so perhaps becoming also dangerous, and fairly radicalized over this type of change. And eventually the only way possible for a correction is at the ballot box. They'll go to a ballot box and say what they like or not, unless politics deals with it.
Well, looking at the time, it seems it's time to wrap up. If there's a comment from the audience that, like, you really need to get out, that is the time now. That is the time to give your comment. If not, I would ask Lucas to wrap this up, because he's on the most tech-savvy guy among us, I guess. So what do you see the app-based economy? I mean, how does it have to change not to radicalize societies and to still have this element of innovation and bringing the economy forward?
Maybe I'm too blasé about it, but effectively, if we're making sure that we apply the same working time regulations, the same pension regulations, if as Glenn says, we treat work as work, that's really all we have to do. And maybe this is a too simplistic Estonian way of thinking of it, that we think this is kind of making those legislative changes is within the realm of the possible. And maybe if I were to pull that to my sort of broader contribution to the wrap-up, if politics works and does what it's supposed to do, and that includes connecting to policy, right, which is often civil servants and ministries working off of that, analysis and facts, and not doing a very good job connecting to voters and the media. But if those two can connect with each other and actually can adjust and react in a sort of human time frame of months and years, not decades, then maybe we don't need to have too many youth and politics panels.
Well, that's a great wrap-up. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. Before you head out to that vegetarian dinner, 80% of you at least, can I ask you to open up Works Up one last time? I have a question that I have to ask you to answer. That's a good question, actually. Then the question is, do you find today's event a good forum for exchanging opinions and ideas related to the EU?
Trouble.
Yes, no, or I don't know. You have 30 seconds to pick your answer. And then we're going to see the results. I'm going to give you another 20 seconds there. I think it was a good way. I'm biased, of course, but I enjoyed the conversation. We're going to see if the audience did as well. The sun even came out. So 10 last seconds, and then we're going to look at the answers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's see what you thought. Wow. Was that one person?
Yeah, how many people?
We need to have independent electoral commission.
Can you raise your hands? Who did that? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, more than 3, 4 people. Thank you very much for participation. Thanks very much for the panelists. See you around.